Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sumant Kulkarni, and I cover neuroscience-focused companies for Canaccord Genuity, which is an investment bank. And I also happen to cover a lot of the psychedelic companies since they went public almost. So it's been some time covering them. We've seen a renaissance of psychedelic therapeutics, and the next 12 to 18 months have a bunch of data sets that are coming out that will hopefully lead to more investor interest in the space. With that, I'll turn it over to Ginger for an intro.
Thank you, Sumant, and thank you to Leonard and the organizers. I'm with Lumanity, which is a global strategic services company, and we cover the drug development spectrum from really early to post-launch. But I am part of the strategy consulting team and personally focus on early commercial strategy for novel therapeutics, and my area of interest for the past, I won't even tell you, long time, has been CNS quite broadly. I know that Sumant knows this space very well, and I believe has led a panel with his team several times. So I'm coming in from 30,000 feet, knowing enough to be dangerous. I'm usually very easygoing, but I'm going to try to be a bit contrarian today. So hope that's okay. So with that, if I could ask you all to introduce yourselves briefly, just going down the row, starting with Daniel.
Whoops. I don't know what that was. Hey, everybody. My name is Dan Karlin. I am a psychiatrist and psychodynamic psychotherapist by training. But here in this role, I'm the chief medical officer of a company called MindMed. And at MindMed, we have just launched a phase 3 pivotal program for the development of LSD, which you've probably heard of, for the treatment of generalized anxiety disorder, which you probably have, and major depressive disorder, which I hope you don't.
Nice.
Okay, always fun to be on the panel with you, Dan. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Doug Drysdale. I'm the CEO of Cybin. We're a public biotech company focused on mental health, as you can expect. I think the work we're doing at Cybin is a little different than what you'll hear about from some of the other panelists here today, in that rather than working with naturally occurring molecules, or at least synthetic versions of naturally occurring molecules, psychedelics in nature have been around for forever and been used by indigenous species populations for thousands of years. We've actually modified some of these compounds and have taken them into the clinic. So we have a modified version of psilocin. Psilocin is the active agent in psilocybin, which typically comes from magic mushrooms. Psilocybin is a prodrug, is not active. Psilocin is the active agent. So we've modified psilocin and also modified DMT, which is the active agent in ayahuasca. We have these two programs in the clinic. We've just started phase 3 with our deuterated psilocin asset. And I have to say that the phase 2 results we're seeing so far are nothing short of fantastic. We're seeing, after just 2 doses of this compound, 75% of patients in remission from their depression, which is quite remarkable. And then at 1 year, following just 2 doses, with no further treatment in between, still 70% of patients in remission. So without any depressed symptoms, 1 year after 2 doses. So while there's, I think, some pessimism and some cynicism around CNS and psychiatry, certainly heard that in the last panel, I think there's a lot to be excited about with psychedelics and the dramatic changes that they can bring to patients' lives.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Tucker, scientist by training, molecular biologist, biochemist, but currently the CEO of Enveric Biosciences. Like Cybin, also NASDAQ, or I should say publicly traded like Cybin. And also, I think a little different than what you're going to hear from some of the other folks on the panel. I think we're the one company on this panel that has made the leap of faith, maybe, to go for non-psychedelic psychedelics, to try to sidestep some of the issues that we are going to hear about on the panel today that many of the psychedelics companies are facing, but of course, embracing a whole new challenge, a new question of does it even work if it's not psychedelic? But anyway, this will be a good panel today.
Afternoon, everyone. Kabir, Nath, CEO of Compass Pathways. Compass is currently in phase 3 with Cybin for treatment-resistant depression. First data from our first phase 3 expected in the second quarter of this year. I guess most of us have done way too many panels together, but looking forward to this one.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm Sahil Kirpekar. I'm Chief Business Officer with Atai Life Sciences. Physician by training, 17, 18 years now in drug development, a lot of it in large and small companies. Atai is, again, obviously developing psychedelic treatments for mental illness. We are focusing and heavily, increasingly on the short-acting psychedelics, which show promise to overcome some of the concerns that have been expressed in the past around, sort of the long-acting ones, and that we believe has the ability to actually reach every patient that needs these treatments. There's a long way to go. There's evidence to be generated and regulators to overcome, and we continue to work in that space.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Mays. I'm the CEO of Reunion Neuroscience. We are a private psychedelic therapeutic developer of a molecule called RE104, which is a prodrug of 4-hydroxy-DIPT. We are the only company in the world that's developing 4-hydroxy-DIPT prodrug, which has a chemical structure very similar to psilocybin, but Dr. Alexander Shulgin identified it in the 1950s, and we have brought it forward under a prodrug design to initially our lead indication is in postpartum depression. We in phase 2, 72 patient study only in the United States, and expect to have data read out in mid 2025. From there we plan to also start a study in adjustment disorder. That study is being initiated at the first half of 2025.
Thanks for the intros here. For a moment there, I thought I was hallucinating because I saw a couple of people in the audience still wearing a tie, like myself. In case I'll kick this off. A couple of big picture questions. First, how do you view what's happened in a kind of post-Lycos world? How has that affected you? And in terms of the political environment, we've seen some people potentially at the highest levels of the incoming administration have a favorable take on psychedelics. Do you think that's a headwind or a tailwind, and why?
Do you mind if I give a corollary? So post-Lycos, clearly there's still a lot of interest in psychedelics, but I just want to know your thoughts on the FDA. How ready is the FDA to grapple with something like psychedelics, and how willing are they? Do you see them as a friend or the other thing?
Do we want to start? Do we want to go this way or that way? It's easy if we all agree, right? And everyone up here has heard me say this before, so I'll say it again for you. The big change that happened after the Lycos AdCom, particularly, the CRL seemed inevitable once the AdCom happened, was that all of us had to learn the phrase Lycos-specific issues and use it a lot. From a distance, things flatten, right? And so often you hear the concept of psychedelic drugs, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, whatever, and it lumps a bunch of different things into the same bucket. None of us are developing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy products, and a lot of what happened at that AdCom, and it's very likely to be in the CRL, though I don't think any of us have seen that CRL, have to do with specifics of the way that those trials were conducted. There's a particular issue with MDMA as a session-based treatment, which is that no one has ever made the claim that MDMA, independent of psychotherapy, in a session-based treatment modality is efficacious. The history of MDMA in psychotherapy was as a psychotherapy enabler, and I think commonly we all think it works. It worked when it was used that way before it was scheduled, and it will probably work that way in the future. But a assisted psychotherapy paradigm creates some real issues when you come to regulatory science, which is how do you take something that is notoriously difficult to study, psychotherapy, combine it with something else that is notoriously difficult to study, PTSD, and do a reliable drug study that can show drug effect. It's a real challenge, and Lykos was out there before any of us were trying to meet that challenge. Lots of lessons learned there, particularly for and from FDA, who we had the pleasure really of meeting FDA a week after that AdCom. They were clearly shaken by it. They didn't expect it to go the way it went. They had hoped it would go differently. They clearly went into the AdCom looking for a path toward a label, probably a narrow label, probably a restrictive REMS, but they wanted to approve that drug. So FDA is not the obstacle, as they so often aren't. They don't always make your life easier. They don't always give you the clear answers you wish you'd gotten when you ask the question, but very much the signal we're seeing, and I think all of us are seeing in our conversations with the agency, is that this is not an agency who's afraid of unleashing something on the world. It's an agency that sees it as their role to potentially help change the field of psychiatry.
Dan, I'll agree with that. I think our interactions with FDA have been very positive. I think the fact that FDA has come out with clinical trial guidance fairly early in development of psychedelics is a positive sign. And the fact that FDA has granted 4 or 5 breakthrough therapy designations now across the sector is a positive sign. I genuinely believe from our interaction with them that they're looking for ways to approve these compounds in a safe and effective way. I'll give Lykos a bit of a break in that I think their IND was filed in 92, something like that, so quite a long time ago. And there's no surprise that FDA's understanding of these compounds and their thoughts around these compounds, their guidance, has shifted since 1992. And it's clear that the Lykos program didn't keep up with that. One other comment is I think that anyone that listened to the AdCom around MDMA, the AdCom focused very much on functional unblinding, disproportionately so. It's easy to focus on that with psychedelics because, of course, patients generally know they're taking a psychedelic drug. But the reality is that all CNS drugs, psychiatric drugs, have an element of functional unblinding. If you're taking a benzodiazepine, if you're taking an antipsychotic, likely even if you're taking an SSRI, you'll know you're taking it. So this is not a new problem. It's well understood by FDA and fully incorporated in their guidance and in our phase 3 program to deal with. So I think the outcome was a bit of a misnomer. And I agree, Dan. I think body language from FDA going into that outcome is that they were likely ready for some kind of narrow approval. I agree. But overall, I think the experience has been helpful. For us also, similarly to MindMed, we met with FDA right after that event, and so we're able to incorporate all of those learnings and concerns into our own program.
Maybe just an additional point to add to that. I mean, the way we see this, Lykos was not the first psychedelic or even psychedelic-like treatment to go through the FDA's Spravato has been that as ketamine, and they've clearly had success. They've had a path, so the FDA continues to evolve. They've obviously published the guidance. I would say a lot of us have benefited a lot from the feedback that the FDA has given. It's another sort of way of engaging and getting input from the agency as things evolve. So clearly Lykos had some very Lykos-specific issues, but I would say there's takeaways right from the way doses need to be managed to unblinding and the rest, which do not apply to us, but help the rest of us ensure that the boxes were ticked through our trials moving forward.
So I think, did you ask the future question as well? I think you did, yes. So, I mean, the straight answer to that is we have no idea what the new administration means, but we're all asked all the time what it may mean. I think the way we see it is at the very worst, it's neutral, but there are clearly areas in which it could be a positive win for us as well. I think the important thing is none of us believe that the fundamental standards for assessing benefit risk in pivotal trials should change. But if around the fringes there's some easing around, for instance, early access programs and how you might get those to patients, potentially some easing of actually doing clinical trials in psychedelics, which is enormously complex because of the Schedule 1 nature and so on. So I think we see it as, potentially favorable, but certainly neutral at best, but clearly until after January the 20th and even a long time thereafter, we're not actually going to know.
I think our experience, I'll echo the experience of others, has been quite positive with the FDA. We found them to be, and I've worked in other therapeutic areas where I get a real sense in our calls that they're trying to find a way. I'm appreciative of the fact that they did do the clinical trial guidance. What really changed for me though after, and I think our company and maybe others after the Lykos decision was, wow, the questions from investors quickly pivoted, right? So for almost 2 years since I've been working in the development capacity here, that the questions were largely focused on access, reimbursement, pricing, how's this all going to work, specialized treatment centers, and the commercial infrastructure. Everything was about the commercial infrastructure. Greg, I understand psychedelics can be safe and efficacious, but boy, how are you going to get them to patients safely? But now the questions quickly pivoted. I think, and I think in large part too, probably because their investors are seeing sort of the success that Spravato has paved forward in their distribution of the product. But now the questions are really from investors: how are you going to deal with functional unblinding and expectancy bias?
Take it. Okay. Thank you. That was very helpful. Obviously there's a lot of risk here from the scientific, the biological, the clinical, regulatory, and commercial. Being CNS, being this therapeutic category, you're probably one of the highest risk, categories. There is one of the most strategic decisions that you've all made is, what is your lead indication? And you're looking, you're circling around similar indications with exception of reunion on the end. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, some of those markets are loaded with generic options. Some have absolutely nothing. So when you think about what do you go in with first, is it really tied to the biology, the patient population or segment that you're carving out? The ability to get to these patients? What is it that drove you to that indication of choice?
I shouldn't always start.
Okay. Maybe I'll take a step back a little bit and just say that I think there's a lot to be excited about with psychedelics. We heard on the last panel somewhat cynicism around CNS and psychiatry drug development, and it's understandable, isn't it, that most new CNS and psych drugs have pretty small effect sizes. They require large studies because of that, and they take a long time because many of these drugs take many weeks to work. And then, of course, we also see quite a number of study failures in CNS and psychiatry and neurodegenerative diseases, etc. So I can understand the cynicism. I think what's really exciting about psychedelics is that the effect sizes are huge. We are seeing effect sizes 8 or 10 times higher than those generic SSRIs that you mentioned, Ginger. We're seeing rapid effects within a day. Patients free from their depression and anxiety disorders within a day, and highly durable effects. We're seeing effects out to a year after just 2 doses. So I think there's a lot to be excited about with this sort of drug development, and in a frankly a capital markets environment where there's a lot of cynicism and a lot of impatience for quick returns. Psychedelics could be seen as something that's a bit of a bright light as we go into 2025. Specifically around the indication, we're targeting major depressive disorder. It's a condition that affects 21 million adults in the US. Current treatments deliver about one third remission rate, which is obviously pretty low. It takes 4 to 6 weeks or so to work, and for most patients, they experience mostly just a blunting of their depressive symptoms and also of their positive emotions as well. So patients become somewhat dependent, not necessarily addicted to SSRIs, but somewhat dependent upon them. And there's really been very little innovation, really no innovation, major innovation in psychiatry since the advent of Prozac, really 40 years ago. And this is the biggest breakthrough in psychiatric pharmacology in the last 40 years. And are we competing against SSRIs and the atypicals? No, not really. I mean, these are going to be third-line treatments, no doubt about that. I can't see us suddenly leaping ahead and being first line when you have most patients are initiated by their GP, by their family doctor. SSRIs are well understood. And patients will cycle through those first couple of lines of treatment. Once you get beyond that, there's really very few options for patients, and those options are pretty unpleasant as well. So I think we're feeling very positive about the reception so far from providers and from payers for the indication that we've selected.
Yes. I guess we'll move on to the next one.
Maybe a quick, and I think to even expand beyond Doug's comment on this sort of cynicism about psychiatry, and I think that this cynicism is misplaced, and what it should be is skepticism about the diagnostic categories. The reason that modern drug development has failed psychiatry, and therefore psychiatry has been failing patients, is because we've been play-acting science. You can't take something like major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, which just constructually in the DSM have an 80% construct overlap that nobody thinks have some sort of underlying unifying biology, that everybody with MDD has the same biological underlying neuroscientific change, or everyone with anxiety has the same underlying neuroscientific change. If we all agree that these aren't biological entities, that they probably represent dozens, if not hundreds, of rare diseases at a biological level, what sort of insanity is it to go for narrower and narrower mechanisms that are not allowed to have off-target effects? They have to be safer than SRIs and work better than SRIs. And lumping people together when we don't think there's any reason biologically that they should be lumped together. Why would we think that would work? Right? Of course it didn't work. We've been play-acting neuroscience in psychiatry for decades. What we got permission to do with these drugs is take drugs that aren't as safe as water, that have a wild set of off-target adverse events. And likely those adverse events are at least a part of the mechanism for some people. But it's the very breadth of the mechanism that makes these drugs so wildly effective.
That's a great point, I guess. And it's a good kind of segue into the next question, which is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I would say that most patients would consider use of a psychedelic therapeutic only if it had a durable effect, especially in an episodic kind of as-needed treatment on that basis. So what would you say, this is more of an investor question to kind of make life easier for myself if I'm doing a modeling exercise. What's your sweet spot for durability of effect in terms of weeks or months?
I'm going to start by questioning your question. I agree that the better durability with these treatments, the better, obviously. Nobody wants to really have a psychedelic experience every week. But that said, esketamine is being dosed every 2 weeks. Some patients are coming back every 2 weeks, 26 times a year. So it shows you the level of motivation that there is from patients that really are struggling to find any help anywhere else. So I just question, sort of challenge the question a little bit, but I agree that more durable is better. One of the challenges with that esketamine protocol, of course, is that because it has to be dosed in a clinical setting, as psychedelics do, those patients are taking up all this space. And they come in as a new patient, and then they're coming back every 2 weeks. So these clinics are getting full pretty quickly. So if we're able to dose patients less frequently, and so far we're seeing 2 doses last a year for 70% of patients, then we're freeing up a lot of capacity, not just in terms of these rooms, but in terms of psychiatry overall. Only about 18% of psychiatrists are available to see new patients. There's a real lack of resources. So I think these intermittent or infrequent treatments have a real potential to change the whole treatment landscape, not just the pharmacology.
Yeah, I think just to build on Doug's point, I mean, given what's available today, I think most of us are looking at primary endpoints at 6 weeks. I would say something that's 6 weeks is going to be transformational and paradigm busting. That said, clearly all of us are seeing how far we can push duration. To the extent there's a precedent here, long-acting injectables have been widely available for schizophrenia and bipolar. Typically, as you talk to psychiatrists and so on, anything that goes much beyond 3 months, they're not actually that comfortable with because they actually do want to see the patients again. So that might be the sweet spot, but we have to see it. It's going to depend from mechanism to mechanism.
One of the most interesting things to me that we saw in our phase 2 data for LSD was that after a single treatment, like others have described, we saw massive clinical change evident the day after treatment, moving primary endpoints, at the first measurable time point, which is a week after treatment. And what this looks like, which is unusual in psychiatry outside of psychotherapy. Someone at the end of a course of psychotherapy has had a state change. It's not that they exist in the same way and feel different. They in fact are different. And that's what we see here, right? With an SRI, people report that they feel less bad. If you predominantly feel bad, feeling less bad is a great thing. But it's not a state change. It's a change in a trait. And what we see and what we saw in our precedent data and what we expect to see moving forward is that after a single dose of drug, people are different. They seem to reach a new state and stay there. What's likely, I think we'll all find increasingly over time, is that some people need a few doses, a couple doses, 1 dose to reach that changed state. And then they exist in that different way for an unknown period of time. They have a brain that remains susceptible to the badness, whatever that badness was, anxiety, depression, susceptible to the after effects of trauma, so on. Pain's right there, by the way. Pain, depression, addiction are pretty indistinguishable at the margins. And that person probably susceptible to whatever it was that led them to the path of anxiety, depression in the first place, but that it would take a new insult of some sort to put them back in the state they were in. And now what we know is this is someone who is responsive to the treatment so that their state can be reset by retreatment.
So just to take that a bit forward, I mean, the way we see this at the moment, without obviously having all the data we would have at the time this potentially comes to market, is what the frequency would be potentially very different in the second year versus the first year when the patient is on this medication or one of these medications, because they might support each other and build off each other. One thing that was touched on in the previous panel, which could have a very different meaning in case of psychedelics, is precision psychiatry. And the aspect there, I think that could be quite relevant is when's the redosing happening? What data can help support that decision on if the patients should get that next dose and at what frequency? So sure, there's a modeling aspect to it, but there'll be a clinical aspect that will keep evolving, and real-world data will also inform how that builds out.
And one approach that we've taken at Reunion is our clinical development programs. Our first 2 phase 2 proof of concept studies are in an acute setting. So the expectation is that a woman with moderate to severe postpartum depression will actually be cured, and if it does return, it's actually a chronic major depressive disorder at that point. But so we're excited about the concept of really just having to dose once and show the change.
Maybe I'll jump in on this for maybe a completely different perspective, and I'll start by qualifying and saying all of our results at this point are in animals, so completely irrelevant to humans probably, since this is psychiatry. But really interestingly, we've, with our non-hallucinogenic psychedelics, where we often test head-to-head in animal models with psychedelics, we've seen in the animal models a durability, but it's not 6 weeks from a single dose. It's not 6 months from a single dose. We might see a day or we might see a week of genuine durability. And I'm talking the psychedelic as well as, head-to-head our non-psychedelic. And so for us, it's been really essential as we think about, addressing the durability question, because what's durability? What do you want? Forever is what you want, right? You either want this to be a one and done, which was some of the early hype, I think, around psychedelics. Wouldn't that be fabulous? And I absolutely think it would be fabulous. Or at least something that you can take regularly if that's what you need to do. And so for us, with a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic, only non-hallucinogenic in animals so far, we don't know if that's true in humans, but we have the potential of something that we can dose regularly. So if it's only durable for a week or it's only durable for a day, well, maybe we can take it every day. And so we can achieve the outcome in a different way, maybe in a more classical pharma-friendly way. At least that's the approach that we're taking, because we haven't seen, in our hands, huge durability of response. Again, we're only treating animals, and what we've seen in humans, what everyone has seen in humans, has been, much more exciting than the depression we're treating in rats, I guess. Anyway.
Okay. So, first of all, I'm not a cynic. I have my cynic hat on, but I would venture to say that the audience really appreciates not just your passion, but the clear articulation of the unmet need for these indications, and that we are not going to address that unmet need by not being incredibly bold. And I applaud what you guys are doing. So, but now my question. Getting into the nuance of treatment paradigms a bit, and we've touched on it already. So 2 things. One, the psychedelic experience. Do we need it? Do we absolutely need it? And then psychological support is how fundamental is that to positive outcomes, or the outcomes that we're looking for?
just give it a shot, right? So my answer to that first question is we don't know. Is the honest answer, right? We have a hypothesis, obviously each one of us does and each company does. The space does not know what the answer is. However, what I can say is there is, even if it is anecdotal, and some evidence on the fact that drugs with the sort of psychedelic experience around them have some effect. We are yet to see any data that drugs without the psychedelic experience show benefit, but time will tell and data will say more. I'll let someone else answer the other one.
I can add to that, I think. I think it's likely that these neuroplastogens that don't have a psychedelic effect will likely be somewhat effective. I think looking at the mechanisms, looking at the fact that they develop and cause neuroplasticity, likely to be somewhat effective. But it's a question of scale of effect. SSRIs deliver neuroplasticity, and we know we know how effective they are. Psychotherapy generates neuroplasticity, and it takes months, years for that to be fully effective. So we can go down the path of daily dosing with small changes, and that may be fine for some patients. But I think what's really exciting about the opportunity with psychedelics is this changing the possibility to change the course of disease to the point, as Dan mentioned, where the level of neuroplasticity is so great that patients are able to use those tools to rewire their own maladaptive patterns of thinking so that they are different or their thinking patterns are different. They're not in that same cycle, which is why we're seeing these highly durable effects. So I think it's a question of choice. Obviously, it's a whole different clinical risk profile, developing acute, intermittent treatments with very large effect sizes compared to studying chronic treatments that have short durability and small effect sizes, and we've chosen the former.
Can I jump into? Yeah. Since we're talking about this subject, yeah, and I think I think we actually all agree here, even though we've maybe made different bets. We certainly are optimistic, hopeful, certainly in rats and mice, although again, this is psychiatry, so we'll see whether that means anything at all. But neuroplasticity, the effects we've seen, again, only in rodents, are on par or let's say unparable with what you get from a strong psychedelic agent. We certainly hope that the psychedelic agents are successful. We think there will be patients who will embrace it and for whom it will be absolutely the right answer. We also think there's going to be quite a few patients who don't want to go down that path. And so for them, a take-it-home molecule that doesn't require this kind of high infrastructure, high oversight, high experience are all things that they're not going to want to do. And so we think from a scale point of view, maybe there are different patient populations. And maybe it ends up different populations, or maybe, and I think we even heard this in the last panel, maybe it's a 1-2. You have an induction and you have a maintenance. And the two together are synergistic. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. So it remains to be seen. In answer to the question, as far as I'm aware, there's, I'm fairly aware, there's no human trials yet that have taken a pure neuroplastogen induction of neuroplasticity as the mechanism that have shown efficacy in patients. We don't know at all, but I'm optimistic. That's why we're making the bet that we're making.
So I'll start on the second part before Dan jumps in. So first, I think we should collectively take credit that we've managed to move from psychedelic-assisted therapy to psychological support, but that's a staging post because we actually need to move from psychological support to whatever we're going to land on next, and I don't think we've reached consensus of whether that's facilitation or monitoring or, frankly, nothing. But a couple of points. First, we are not anti-psychotherapy on this platform, just to be clear. We do believe it has a place, but we're all focused on a drug intervention and on demonstrating that a drug intervention has all the effects and so on that Dan was talking about. So yes, we've moved to something called psychological support. We actually need to move beyond that because it's not even that.
I guess I don't really need to jump in then. Yeah, what we've taken to calling what happens in the room is assistance and monitoring, because I can't think of words that mean less than that. But the point about the experience, I think, is a really interesting one, and we're doing some human research to try to extrapolate a bit of what can be attributed to experience versus what can be attributed to sort of non-experiential drug effects. And we're never going to have a full answer to that question, but the answer is always going to be yes, that the experience matters to some people probably a lot. Other people probably don't want to do that. And maybe for some people, it doesn't. It's not the mechanism. And until we have better ways of understanding psychiatric illness, that will always be the case. And that's okay. We don't even know how SRIs work. And we've been writing scripts for those for 35 years. No idea how they work. It's certainly not through the blockade of the reuptake of serotonin. That happens after dose 1. What happens during the 6 weeks in between? I don't know. And you don't either. It might be track B, right? That's the current fad. Psychiatry loves to do this. We love to get all fired up about a new mechanism, and then we spend 20 years saying, that's the mechanism. And then someone writes a paper that says, that's not the mechanism. Of what? Right? Every paper that says, the underlying dopamine hypothesis or serotonin hypothesis of this disease or that disease is wrong is actually playing part of the problem, which is that a paper that says serotonin is not the underlying cause of depression ought to say depression's not a thing, so there isn't an underlying cause. It's a bunch of things with a bunch of underlying causes. So be careful when psychiatry gets excited mechanistically. That's just not the level we operate at.
Can I go back to the first part again? So I just want another thought around the interventional nature of these psychedelic compounds is that they could be potentially hugely empowering for patients. When you think about the way we treat depression today, they go to see the physician, they're given a prescription, they're taking something every day. It works or it doesn't work. They have side effects or they don't. They go back, the physician adjusts it. The patient's not in control. The patient's just doing what their physician has told them to do. And many of them go on for years, decades, with treatments that are somewhat ineffective. The potential with these psychedelic compounds is that patients can be empowered to seek an intervention, and it's their choice, it's their investment in time, and they can decide to have that experience and take control of their depression and make change. It's kind of like GLP-1s, in that we've had all the tools to deal with obesity forever. Change your diet, get some exercise, all those things, but those are hard. Those are hard things to do every day, and it's difficult for patients to make those changes. But GLP-1s empower patients to go and make a change, and it's their investment, their commitment. I see some parallels there.
Next, we'll move to conduct of clinical trials and regulatory interactions, and I'll keep this question really short and to the point. You can answer it any way you like, but is functional unblinding really an issue for this class of products in a clinical trial context?
Not if you design the studies right.
Yes, and somebody already said this, but every psychiatric drug has functional unblinding. Every study of psychiatric drugs has been biased by functional unblinding. It's just the reality. The point of the drugs is that they make you feel different. Like, of course they get unblinded. So we design our studies to address that as best we can. We try to separate out things like primary outcome assessment and make sure that that blind is preserved. We try to keep investigators blinded where we can. You don't have someone who's been in the room during the experience doing much rating of anything that you care about from an efficacy standpoint. So the answer is yes. And I think we've all had now a very similar conversation with the agency, which is to say, here are things we can do to try to address all of the methodological concerns that have been raised about the class and raised in psychiatry. And I think we're all doing the right thing, which is to ask, right? Psychiatry for a really long time in sponsored trials just didn't ask about unblinding. There's this sort of attitude of if you cover your eyes and don't measure something, well, then at least you're not accountable for what you didn't measure. We're clearly not going to get away with that in this space. In this space, we're being asked to look at everything we can. And I think the right thing to do is to ask, to do your best to interpret the data, despite the fact that there are always going to be methodological concerns. And you wrap your study designs around those concerns in such a way that you come out with an interpretable package.
And not to skip back on the topic, but I think the reason functional unblinding has become a more significant conversation since Lycos was because there was a very specific issue there that the therapists themselves were unblinded, which meant that the spectrum of therapy that the patient received was different, and that completely changed what you could have from the effect, and that questioned the entire design. So I think there's a basis which I don't see will impact the rest of the trials, and they'll be seen more in the light of traditional psychiatry trials.
I think one advantage that psychedelic trials have over traditional studies, the chronic dosing studies, is that the intermittent nature of the dosing and the durability of effects kind of overcome expectancy bias. We know that a lot of NPD studies fail because the drug fails to separate from placebo. Why is that? Because we're dosing the active agent every day and we're dosing the placebo every day. And so you're reinforcing the expectancy of placebo. And so it's hard to separate. When you're only dosing these treatments once or twice, you're not reinforcing the placebo effect. And so there's less risk of separation here, which makes these studies less risky. But also when we're looking at durability over time, you can't tell me that expectancy bias leads to efficacy 1 year down the road after 2 doses. So yes, this is a real issue, functional unblinding, but it's been well addressed by FDA for quite some time.
Okay. Who was it? I think maybe it was you, Greg. Talked about investors are really talking about infrastructure. So we're switching a little bit moving ahead a little bit to commercial models. So the infrastructure, intermittent dosing, we've talked about the need for the psychedelic experience, the monitoring, and it could be hours, psychological support. There are some things to deal with in this market as you look at the infrastructure. What are your thoughts on the state of the infrastructure to support the commercialization of these drugs? And we often see companies or biotech companies will partner with big pharma, but is big pharma any more equipped to deal with paving the way for these drugs? Anybody?
There you go. Right. So let's go back a bit. And when Spravato was launched, it was a different time. There was not a lot of there. J&J didn't invest, and there were other things that built out in parallel to that. We've today looking at about, give or take, 4,500 to 5,000 certified clinics. That number keeps growing very quickly, and there's various estimates at what speed it would grow. I think it's important to point out that infrastructure and the patient numbers that are working alongside, depending on how you calculate the numbers, it's anywhere between 35 to 55,000 patients. That's leading to the $1 billion number. If you look at that, that's based on whatever 12 weeks of dosage. Let's say 12 doses a year. It might be more, it might be less, but that's probably the average. And the numbers that were thrown out earlier assumes that maybe it's a dose every 3 months with the treatments we're talking about here. Just looking at that, you've got the current infrastructure can accommodate at least 4 times as many patients. And that, assuming that infrastructure at least doubles, if not multiplies from there by the time these treatments reach there, I don't think infrastructure on its own is going to be the roadblock in making this happen. Yes, there'll be other resources needed, which will need to be accommodative, right from incentives for those providing this treatment, whatever monitoring support is needed, making sure that the codes work depending on how each treatment is differently delivered and the rest. To try sort of quickly touch on the second point is would big pharma be relevant? I would say yes and no, because a lot of it comes down to how much further does this need to scale up? The real value of pharma is achieving scale beyond what we are seeing here today based on that. And if the data for these treatments shows that the potential for this is at a place where it can be multiplied, beyond what the Spravato numbers have been able to achieve, there is a place, but I think time will tell as to what true value is there in these treatments.
Okay, I'll go. I agree. I think that infrastructure has been a bottleneck until recently, and that bottleneck is going to go away. Even with the 4,500 centers that are available today, 80-90% of the prescriptions are coming from 10 or 15% of them. So we've got a lot of capacity to build within the existing infrastructure base, and it's likely to be double by the time we get to market. So I don't think the physical space is necessarily a challenge. These centers will need hand-holding, though. This isn't a typical sales rep role where they're dropping off samples. Obviously, you can't drop off samples of these. It's going to be training staff on patient care, training staff on REMS, helping with reimbursement, prior authorizations, all that fun stuff. And it's going to be some hand-holding. And that's not typically, as Sahil has said, it's not typically the big pharma model. It's not about boots on the ground. It's about building relationships and more of a key account manager type approach than a typical sales rep. The other thing you mentioned, Ginger, was time. And, Spravato being dosed 26 times a year, each session is a 2-hour observation period, so 52 hours a year. We are looking at with our treatments potentially 8 to 12 hours a year, something along the time frame. So I don't see that time is going to be the real issue. I think our job will be to maximize the efficiency of the infrastructure and try to help the second, third, fourth deciles of these centers increase their capacity. So.
Maybe even beyond the infrastructure, one thing that I have been absolutely heartened and somewhat amazed by is just how enthusiastic the fields of psychiatry and psychology have become about these treatments. Working psychiatrists who are paid by third-party payers are largely relegated to rapid med management visits. 6 patients an hour, 10-minute visits, check an SRI dose, maybe add a second-generation antipsychotic, hope for the best. The tools to treat people have been inadequate to the task put before psychiatry. And while plenty of psychiatrists do psychotherapy for cash, you can't really get compensated at a reasonable rate as a psychiatrist to do psychotherapy by third-party payers. So that when psychiatrists are willing to treat folks who can't afford to pay out of pocket and who are in fact dependent on their payer paying the fee, they just don't have very many good options to offer those folks. And so what we've seen in psychiatry, and I know we're all seeing the same thing, we've got a lot of the same folks on our various advisory committees, is that from the very top of the field, the past presidents of APA and such, there's a ton of enthusiasm all the way through that sort of working middle of the field that are usually the last folks to get on board with innovation. And then I teach residents occasionally still. Can't imagine what it is I'm supposed to teach them. But there are now 3rd, 4th year psychiatry residents who picked this field because of these drugs. Now, I'm not sure that's a great idea, but it's still just a drug or a few drugs. But the idea that this field is ready for change can't be overstated.
Yeah, I think just to build on your point, Dan, we've actually seen this month itself, both APAs, both psychiatry and psychology, very much engaging and acknowledging that this is going to happen. And I think that's a huge positive.
Yeah, but I think the big bottleneck is not necessarily on the commercial infrastructure. The bottleneck I see is on the clinical infrastructure, because unfortunately, all of us on this panel, are really required, obviously, to establish clinical data sets through clinical research sites, and there's really, quite frankly, it's not enough right now. So while there's 4,500 commercial centers for Spravato, I would like to see the number triple or quadruple for clinical sites, because all of us on this panel are tripping over each other to try to get priority. There's some wonderful sites out there, but they simply don't have the capacity and dosing days to really fulfill the needs of these companies. So that's something I'm acutely aware of, and I'd like to see in the future. Hopefully, more academic centers will sort of recognize this pathway and really sort of build in some more psychedelic clinical support.
So I'll go back to the durability question, because we spoke about durability of effect, and Doug, you brought up a point about placebo, not being taken every day, those kinds of things. So in a clinical trial context, or even in the real world context, how do you dissociate the safety impact of a durable therapeutic effect from the psychedelic dose itself? What I mean is, like, if I take one dose today and my dose efficacy lasts for 6 months, is that the same time frame you'll apply for safety events to be attributable to that drug, adverse event-wise?
Yes, in that FDA wants us to record all experiences, whether you consider them to be adverse or not. So hallucinogenic or experiences or euphoria, all of these things need to be recorded, both in the session and outside of the session. So we'll follow up patients in our 1-year extension phase 3 every month, and each of those sessions will record any adverse events. So far, I think broadly in all studies that I've seen, and certainly in ours, all of the adverse events were transient. They just occurred during dosing. They were all mild to moderate in intensity and all spontaneously resolved. So we're not seeing any acute serious adverse events to be concerned about. Will there be long-term sequelae? We just don't know yet. We haven't run, and none of us have run very long-term studies. It seems highly unlikely. And there may, of course, as with any drugs, be some very small percentage of patients that have some kind of long-term sequelae, but we're certainly not seeing anything like that right now. It appears that adverse events, mild to moderate, are just occurring during dosing for the most part.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think the real answer is we don't know. We're clearly, and I think Danny made this point earlier, we're recognizing that people's brains change and that they continue to process what is a profound experience over an extended time. And to Doug's point, we will continue to record that and so on. But yeah, I don't think you can exclude the fact that there may be episodes of behavior 6 months or 9 months after an experience, which we have to acknowledge. And just on that, it's interesting. It's just been published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. It's well known, Compass, in the phase 2b, we did have 3 patients who more than 4 weeks after dosing recorded instances of suicidal behavior. One of those has now been written up as a case study. This patient has actually been completely public. Her main complaint is that she was described as a non-responder, which from a technical MADRS perspective is true. As she writes in this, boy, did I respond. So she actually went through a challenging year. At the end of the year, she says she's changed her life around and she would do the experience again.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Please hold for the microphone and raise your hand again.
Pekka Simula from Investor Life Science Venture Capital Fund based in Finland. And thanks to all panelists, as Ginger said, for the optimism you bring to this field. Now, at least Daniel mentioned that that's one of the challenges in conventional drug development in this space is the lack of targeting. So trying to develop one-size-fits-all drugs, for instance, for depression without knowing what the actual mechanism to be targeted is. So what's your answer to this question? Are you also targeting specific subgroups of patients?
The reason I raised that is because we've been given permission to do differently. We are not having to play the precision phenotyping game because, as all of us have seen in the human research we've done, these drugs work really well across the entire set of folks. Now, on this panel, there are people who've gone for treatment-resistant populations, for example. We have not. We've gone as broadly as we possibly can, so essentially all comers, GAD and MDD. But I think this is actually the strength of the family, if we want to call it that, of this type of drugs, which is that they really seem to work for most folks who are in distress.
I agree with that. The only caveat I would add is we also see, though, huge intersubject variability in your response to a specific dose of a specific drug. So in time, understanding better who may need more than one dose or whatever is, I think, a goal. But it's fair to say that in psychedelics, we are as far away from precision psychiatry as everyone else is in psychiatry. So,
There's another.
Hi, thanks so much. Manuel Lerman from UCSD. We actually have a psychedelic trial ongoing for complex regional pain syndrome in our pain department. And I'm the CEO also of Inflammasense, where we're very interested in identifying precision medicine-based indicators of whether or not somebody be a responder. I was really curious about what you said just now, and I was going to ask it earlier, in regard to how many doses or identifying what features you think this space will grow into, and how to identify those patients that may need one or more treatments or a shorter interval in regard to all the different medications that you're using there.
I can start because we're actually doing a slightly different dosing protocol than I think everyone else is doing here, in that we're giving 2 doses rather than a single dose. The reason for that, and we think this is potentially just specific to psilocybin, and maybe does not apply to DMT. We find that the psilocybin experience is kind of a wavy experience, and patients have peaks and troughs of intensity. So there are short periods during the session where they're very much deep in that psychological space, and others parts of the session when they're really not. And this waviness where they're coming in and out of it enables some patients potentially who are skeptical or anxious or not fully trusting of the circumstances that they're in to resist. And we see that in that we see a difference in the first experience and the second experience. So with our first dose, we're getting about 50% response rates and about 20% remission rates. With the second dose, those jumped to about 75% response and 75% remission. And the anecdotal feedback from the monitors in the study is that the second dose is more intense. Theoretically, because patients have already had an experience, they know what to expect the second time, and they fully immerse themselves. And we see incremental efficacy and incremental response remission rates. So we're at a point where I think 75% response remission from 2 doses is sufficient. We don't necessarily think that the third dose is going to add more, but we definitely think that 2 doses is better than 1 in the short term, and we're seeing quite incredible durability, as I mentioned, and so it seems to be working in the long term as well. With our second program, which is a deuterated version of DMT, there's no fighting that. It's pretty hard to resist a DMT experience. Patients are in that space very rapidly within 2 or 3 minutes. And then with our formulation, they stay in that space for about 90 minutes. So we'll see as we get through trials whether there's any difference between 1 dose and 2 doses. But beyond that, I don't think there's been much dosing experimentation across the sector, quite honestly.
Well, I'll just squeeze one last one and keep you from your coffee for a bit. So in terms of questions you get from investors, are there any particularly relevant ones or things that you don't consider are relevant at all? I'll probably start with Greg, because you went from being a public company to a private company. So what do you miss most about interacting with investors, if at all?
No, I mean, we're all on the carousel, so we're all out there, always constantly trying to, these programs are expensive, they're resource intensive, and we continue to sort of, whether public or private, stay relevant to the investment community, which has a lot of questions, but I think is gaining increasing confidence as the clinical data sets roll out.
I have an answer to that. So as a NASDAQ traded company, but on the lower end of the market scale, end up talking to a lot of, I'll say, retail investors. And the most irrelevant question I've ever had in my entire career, I get repeatedly in this space when the retail investor says with a great big smile on his face, "So, do you do it? Have you? Is this your thing? Are you psychedelic? Are you a psychonaut?" And then the secret handshake. Nobody ever asked me that when I was working on cancer drugs or asthma drugs. But, suddenly in this space, it's like, yeah, you do that? You do it too? Yeah. So that's a totally irrelevant question I get all the time.
The corollary to that is that ordinarily I'd say there are no dumb questions if you're willing to buy our stock. But no, we didn't bring samples.
No, in all seriousness, I think investors are rightfully frustrated. We've had a tough 4 or 5 years in biotech in general. Last year, the sector underperformed the broader markets by almost 20%. So that's frustrating. CNS and psychiatry is notoriously challenging. You've had other areas like oncology and precision quantitative development that is, I guess, very, very certain in many ways, but also short term in terms of response and results. And that's not been the case in CNS and psychiatry for a long time. I think psychedelics are different. I think, first of all, the combined market cap of the companies all sitting up here is probably less than $1 billion or something like that, maybe 1.5. So the valuation point for entry right now is very low. And we're all kind of getting through late stage trials. So we're getting towards some very significant and meaningful data sets with assets that have a high probability of success. I don't think anyone has a view that a clinical trial of a psychedelic in depression is going to fail clinically. Every trial has consistently delivered positive results. So I think it's been a challenging few years for investors. Thankfully, the long, knowledgeable biotech investors are sticking at the space. They're still in, and they're doubling down. Retail investors got burned by the whole hype cycle, as often happens, and there's frustration. I think the Lycos situation in the summer of last year slowed any kind of recovery. And now I think folks are waiting for results. But I see this as a great entry point, frankly, with all of our valuations, frankly, and with the potential for success is significantly different than with a traditional depression study.
Thanks to everyone for attending and all our panelists as well.